When I stabbed him, I was still begging him to stop. It wasn't revenge. It was despair. Alone, locked in with an older man who tried to assault me, I fought back, and for that, I was sentenced to death. What happened in that room was never truly investigated. The court didn't want to hear my side. My fear became a crime. My defense became a sentence. And justice was the one who hanged me. My name is Reyhaneh Jabbari, and I was only 19 when it all happened. I was born and raised in Iran, in an ordinary family. I liked reading, drawing, listening to music while rearranging my room. I graduated in interior design, and when I landed my first client, I thought I was beginning my adult life. Nothing prepared me for what came next. If you're watching this video now, maybe you're living in a place where women can walk alone, work, say no, and be heard. But in many countries like mine, a no is treated as defiance, as proof of guilt, and the woman who dares to say no might end up dead or forgotten in a cell. Before I continue my story, leave a comment saying where you're watching it from. I want to know how far my voice has reached. My story didn't start with a crime. It started with a job call. An older man who said he needed help decorating a small office. With my portfolio in hand and hope for a new project, I agreed to meet him. I noted the time, wrote it down the address, and went. I had no idea the place wasn't an office. It was a secluded apartment, and he wasn't just a client. He was a former government agent, someone with connection, with protection. I, on the other hand, was just a young woman trying to start a career. And in that meeting, my life was shredded in minutes. That's where all began, and from there, my freedom never returned. I was an ordinary daughter, not perfect, but present. I liked spending time with my mother, listening to the neighbors' conversations, trying to understand the world through the books I found around the house. My childhood was filled with small dreams, a simple home, the freedom to walk the streets, respect, nothing more. At 17, I fell in love with interior design. The color, the spaces, the details, it all gave me a sense of control. Maybe because in a country where women can barely choose their own clothes, creating spaces felt like a way to breathe. I studied, worked hard, did small projects, and at 19 I had my first big opportunity, an influential client interested in renovating an office. I prepared carefully, chose the right outfit, reviewed my sketches. I imagined that they would change my career. And they did, but not in the way I hoped. Until that morning, my life was still full of plans. I wanted to open a small studio, work with the hotels, study abroad. I didn't think about politics or justice. I was never an activist. All I wanted was to live in peace, do my job, grow quietly. The problem is, for women like me, silence doesn't always protect. Sometimes it's the excuse the system used to pretend nothing happened. That meeting was scheduled like any professional appointment, and time, an address, a client. But the door I walked through didn't lead to an office. It led to a trap. And even when everything started to feel wrong, the closed windows, the strange atmosphere, his look, I still wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting, that he was just eccentric. I was 19, I had no idea how to recognize a predator when he came dressed in respectably. In the next part, I'll tell you what happened inside that apartment, and why even though I survived the attack, the system decided I was the criminal. Because in Iran, when a woman survives, this is what the world wants to understand. How did she have the courage not to die in silence? It was supposed to be just a meeting, a professional contact, like so many others I had before. The address was discreet, but it didn't raise immediate suspicions. After all, many small offices in Tehran operate out of rented apartments. I arrived at the scheduled time. He was already there, the door closed, and there, in that dark room, began the silent collapse of everything I believed was safe. Morteza Sarabandi was a former intelligence agent, a man with status, influence, and a life surrounded by secrets. The kind of man no one confronts. He greeted me with a polite smile and vague questions. He talked little about the project and more about me. Gradually, the tone shifted. He locked the door. The key disappeared. The windows were shut. Only then I realized I had nowhere to run. He offered me something that wasn't in the contract, a dirty deal disguised as kindness. I said no. He insisted, said no one had to know, that if I cooperated, I'd get more contracts, more money. When I refused, the atmosphere changed completely. He got angry, came toward me, and in that moment, my body froze. But my mind screamed for survival. It all happened so fast. He tried to overpower me, forced me to the floor. I resisted, fought with everything I had. And when I saw the blade on the table, I grabbed it without thinking. I struck his shoulder. Once, twice, he fell and I ran. The door was locked, but the key had fallen to the floor. I managed to escape, I managed to leave, but from that moment on, my life was no longer mine. I went straight to the police. I told them everything, but they didn't see a victim. They saw a young woman alone with a married man, and that was enough. The investigation was brief. The official narrative started taking shape before I even realized I was going to be treated as the guilty one. I was handcuffed as if I had confessed to a brutal crime. The knife, the blood, my account, all were seen as evidence against me, not in my favor. At the station, no one wanted to know how I escaped. No one asked why I cried for hours. They just said my case would be handled quickly, and it was. In just a few hours, I went from a panicked young woman to a being treated like a murderer. There was no forensics exam to investigate the sexual assault, no psychological evaluation, no care taken with the testimony. His version, even dead, mattered more than my desperation. They began asking if I had personal motives, if I held a grudge, if I was emotionally unstable. They used my youth against me. They used my initial silence as a weapon. They used my reaction as proof that I had planned it all. My mother saw me for the first time behind bars. She cried. I didn't. Something inside me had already died. What followed was a series of arbitrary decisions. The public prosecutor refused to consider my rape defense, said there were no obvious signs of violence. The presence of the knife was used as evidence of premeditation, and the fact that I had worked alone that day was considered suspicious for a respectable woman. But the worst part wasn't the accusation, it was the silence. While the media reported the death of a respectable businessman, my story was erased. No mention of the attempted assault, no context of desperation. Just a portrait of a woman who was impulsive, dangerous, manipulative. They described me with words I'd never heard in my life, and none of them said survivor. In prison, I heard stories of other women. Many, like me, were there because they said no to the wrong man. Others because they defended themselves. Some because they were raped and got pregnant. All in some way guilty for simply living. The cell they put me in was small, cold, and dark. A space where time didn't pass, or maybe passed too fast. On death row, you learn to count the days by whispers. When someone stays silent for too long, it means the rope has finally been used. And when you hear crying in the middle of the night, it means another sentence has been confirmed. For 7 years, I waited my turn. 7 years waking up from nightmares that weren't just memories, but premonitions. 7 years watching the world forget my name, while newspapers call me a cold-blooded killer, and public defenders wouldn't even reply. I wrote letters, filled appeals, told my story over and over again, until it stopped feeling real even to me. Some human rights groups began to hear my case. A network of women abroad shared my letters. Activists tried to pressure the government, to expose the lack of evidence, the absurdity of a death sentence for a victim of attempted rape. But in there, between those walls, hope was a luxury. My mother visited me every week. She brought fresh bread, news from the neighborhood, and the faith that, honestly, I no longer had. She would say, Reyhaneh, God hasn't forgotten you. I wanted to believe her. But when you're waiting for your own execution, faith becomes a silence that waits in your gut and cuts through your bones. There were days when they called my name over the loudspeaker, and I thought, it's today. But it wasn't. And somehow that hurt even more, because constant terror becomes a kind of torture, a mental punishment that kills you little by little. Even so, I wrote. Every time I got paper, I left behind words that maybe someone someday would read. I wrote about justice, about fear, about not being heard. I wrote for other women because I knew if my voice was erased, maybe my story would survive. When they told me the final appeal had been denied, something inside me went quiet. Not out of fear, but certainty. The certainty that the system had gotten what it wanted. Not justice, but silence. I would have 7 days. 7. To breathe, to hug my mother one last time, and to leave behind something no one could erase. I asked for paper, and I wrote, calmly, with tears, and with the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. It wouldn't be a letter of despair. It would be my testament of truth. Today is my last day, I began. Tomorrow my body will be taken to the place of execution. But I'm not just what they'll say in the newspaper. I'm not just the girl who killed a man. I'm the young woman who screamed for help, who begged for justice, who faced the shame of speaking out about what everyone wanted to hide. In the letter, I asked my mother for forgiveness. Not for fighting, but for making her bury a daughter who was still alive. I told her to never lower her head, that my name was not a shame. It was a reminder of what happens when the world shuts its eyes to a woman's pain. I asked not to be seen as a martyr or as a symbol, but as what I truly was, a 19-year-old girl who just wanted to work, to live, and to make it home safely. I asked people to look at others like me, to save the ones who could still be saved, because if the world would only listen after my death, then let it serve to prevent the next silence. I ended the letter with a sentence that came out on its own, as if my soul were speaking for me. They will stop my heart, but not my story. On the day of the execution, the letter was already being shared among journalists, activists, and ordinary people. The translation crossed borders. Women in Iran cried for me. Women in Europe marched with my name. My scream broke through the gallows. When the rope tightened around my neck, the world was waking up. In Tehran, it was still night. In the West, the day was already beginning with hashtags, but none of it came in time. My last words were for my mother, who begged them to let me live. They didn't, and only then, only after, did the headlines begin to change. My execution became international news. There was no longer a body to protect, no sentence to overturn. It was too late. Human rights organizations that had barely been able to get a word in now had my name on every report. Injustice, they said. Death penalty for a victim of attempted rape. Amnesty International published a condemnation. The UN classified the case as a serious violation of due process. But what do you do with a recognition that comes too late? Marches were held in Paris, Berlin, London. Strangers held signs with my name and photo. Some Iranian women began speaking out discreetly on social media. The repression intensified, but fear no longer silenced as much. My story and the horror of my death had broken an invisible barrier, the one that forces us to accept in silence. In Brazil, in India, in Pakistan, other women saw their own stories reflected in mine. Some wrote letters, others gave interviews, some stepped back from suicidal decisions. Because even though I didn't live to see it, my voice became a path for those still trapped. My mother, devastated, refused to be silent. She spoke out, recorded videos, gave interviews. She didn't ask for revenge. She demanded reform. You killed mine, she said. But how many more will wait for justice to finally face the truth? I died in Iran. But my story repeats itself across dozens of borders, languages, and names. Because the systems that killed me, the one that flips victims and perpetrators, doesn't belong to just one country. It lives in structures, traditions, and laws that still prefer a dead woman over a woman who fights back. There are hundreds of Reyhanehs. Some have known names, others not even dead. Some manage to escape with their lives, but live like fugitives, rejected by their families, isolated from their communities. Others are in prison, awaiting for trial for murder, when all they did was try to survive. But something new is emerging from all this. Voices, connection, movements, women who find themselves in each other's echoes, who tell their stories despite the fear. They expected my name to be forgotten soon after my death, that I'd become a statistic. But what happened was the opposite. The silence of my death screamed so loudly that the world finally listened, even if it's too late. My story became a symbol, not of perfection, not of heroism, but of resistance. Because you don't have to be a saint to deserve justice. You just have to be human. In France, women held up signs with my name and protests against feminicide. In Canada, universities included my case in human rights seminars. In Turkey, activists quoted my letter as a manifesto against the impunity of abusers. My mother became a disruptive voice. She kept saying, "My daughter died because she wanted to live." And that phrase became a rallying cry for thousands of other mothers who lost their daughters to injustice. My final letter was published in dozens of languages, studied, analyzed, wept over. And more than that, it became a mirror for other women who, like me, thought they were alone. I wasn't the first, and sadly, I won't be the last. But if my death prevented another, then it wasn't in vain. Today, when a woman cries, screams, reports, runs, or fights back, she is, without even knowing, continuing what I couldn't finish. And that is the greatest failure of the system that tried to erase me. It turned me into a spark. Reyhaneh Jabbari. Remember that name. It no longer belongs to the courts that condemned me. It belongs to the streets, the classroom, to the voices that refuse to accept that living in fear is normal. Today, every time a young woman reports abuse and it's not believed, my case is repeated. Every time a survivor is humiliated for seeking justice, my death echoes. But also, every time someone shares my story, my life, begins a new chapter.